Democrats have captured the Senate majority after winning two historic victories in Georgia's runoff elections. On Wednesday, CBS News projected Reverend Raphael Warnock narrowly unseated incumbent Republican Kelly Loeffler, making him Georgia's first ever black senator. Democrat John Ossoff also defeated Republican David Perdue by just over 40,000 votes. He'll be Georgia's first Jewish senator and the youngest in the chamber at 33 years old. With Democrats winning both seats, the Senate is now split 50-50. Vice President-elect Kamala Harris will become the tie-breaking vote. The pivotal races shattered records for turnout and spending. Over 4 million people cast ballots. Nearly $500 million was spent on political ads. Andra Gillespie joins me now from Atlanta. She is an associate professor of political science and director of the James Weldon Johnson Institute at Emory University. Andra, welcome. Thanks very much for being with us. So over 3 million Georgians voted before Election Day. In a typical cycle, early turnout would favor Democrats, and Republicans would then close the gap on Election Day. Was this election any different?
This election was highly unusual. So the idea that Democrats voted early wasn't unusual, but the idea that over 2/3 of voters cast their ballots before Election Day meant that it was going to be really hard for Republicans to make up any difference with those votes. So Republicans made a strategic miscalculation when they, by their discussion of fraudulent mail votes, discouraged people from engaging in absentee vote by mail, and perhaps even implicitly, even though they did encourage people to vote early, discouraging people from participating in the early voting process as well. So there was just a deficit that they really couldn't overcome with the votes that arrived on Election Day.
Well, black voters make up roughly 30% of the voter rolls in Georgia. They were, again, the voting bloc responsible for delivering this victory to Democrats. In terms of turnout, what changed from November?
Well, turnout amongst African-American voters, at least as far as what I can tell from the early voting, was higher amongst African-Americans. So in the general election cycle, blacks actually didn't turn out to vote at rates that were commensurate with their proportion in the electorate. It was a little bit below 30%, but it was closer to 31% amongst early voters. And we expect that turnout continued to be robust on Election Day, but we'll await confirmation from the Secretary of State's office. The exit polls also suggest that Latino voters turned out at a proportion that was slightly higher than what their proportion in the electorate is. And so when you're seeing robust turnout from Democratic-leaning groups, that bodes well for the Democratic candidates, as evidenced by Senators-elect Warnock and Ossoff's wins.
Well, you've talked about the diversity of Georgia's electorate. What makes it so different from neighboring states in the South?
It is that diversity, and it's that diversity that leans Democratic that distinguishes Georgia from Alabama or from South Carolina. So all of these states have large African-American populations, and African-American voters make up the majority of Democratic votes in the state. But there's a cap. So, in the Deep South, blacks make up at most about 35% of a state's population. Of course, if you have racial polarization in your party identification and voting, even with blacks voting 90% Democratic, that can't offset a majority white population voting majority Republican. But you can make it up if, one, you have a larger proportion of whites who are willing to vote Democratic, and not by much. And if you have a growing Asian American and Hispanic population that also tends to trend Democratic in its voting behavior. So in the case of Georgia, we have a fast growing Asian American and Hispanic population. These groups break Democratic. And we also have a higher proportion of whites who vote Democratic. And in this election cycle in particular, Joe Biden won because he got 30% of the white vote. And that doesn't seem a lot. But when you have 30% of the white vote and you have a large African-American contingent that's voting 90% Democratic, and you have a growing Asian American and Hispanic population that is also breaking Democratic in its voting behavior, that's enough to get you over the top and to get a majority.
So on a related note, there's been a lot of conversation about the shifting political identity in Georgia's suburban areas, which are trending blue. Which vote do you think was more consequential in the runoffs, the suburban or the black vote?
I think it's the vote of people of color. If we look at the exit poll data from Tuesday, from November, and in previous elections, overall statewide, suburban voters break Republican, and that's actually been pretty consistent across the last few election cycles. And so, in particular, if we want to drill down using the crosstabs from the exit polls, I can't sort of get more granular, but we could ask whether or not we're seeing this shift among college-educated white voters. We don't. So, what's different about the suburbs, particularly the Atlanta suburbs, is that those suburbs are becoming more racially and ethnically diverse. We see it not just in terms of the county's voting behavior in presidential elections and Senate elections and the last gubernatorial election, we're also seeing it at the local level. So, there are towns in Gwinnett County that a decade ago people wouldn't have imagined electing Black or Latino mayors that have elected those in the last 10 years. And in Cobb County, I don't think anybody would have imagined that a Black woman would be the county commission chair, but that's the case today.
Mhm.
And that's because of the changing demographic shifts in the area.
Well, runoff elections are notoriously difficult to poll, but based on what you've seen over the last 48 hours, what's your take, Andra, on the polling for these contests?
Well, the polls predicted that the election was going to be close. And so the polls were within the statistical margin of error. The number that we see in a poll is supposed to be the midpoint of a range of possible vote choices. And so just in general, when I see sort of overlapping ranges, I call the race too close to call. And so my interpretation of the polls this election cycle is that this race was going to be too close to call. So I didn't go into Tuesday with a prediction about who was going to win because the numbers wouldn't allow me to make that type of prediction.
I see. It was a fascinating set of dynamics there in Georgia that we've been watching. Andra Gillespie. Andra, thank you very much for talking to us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.